I've been feeding the same Bigfoot and her baby since 1973. What she finally revealed to me about why her kind fears humans is something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. My name is Robert Caldwell. I'm 78 years old now, and for 51 years, I've been keeping the most important secret of my life. This is that story, and I'm telling it because some truths are too valuable to die with the people who know them. It started on a gray November morning in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, just south of Mount Adams in Washington State. I was 27 years old, working as a timber cruiser for Weyerhaeuser. My job was to survey forest sections, estimate timber yields, mark trees for selective cutting. It was solitary work that suited me perfectly. I'd grown up in these mountains, knew them better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. My father had been a logger, my grandfather before him. The forest was in my blood. That particular morning, I was about 6 miles into the backcountry, working a section of old-growth Douglas fir that the company was considering for harvest. The trees there were massive, some of them 400 years old, trunks so wide 3 men couldn't link arms around them. The canopy was so dense that even at midday, the forest floor stayed in perpetual twilight. I'd been marking trees since dawn, using my diameter tape to measure, my paint gun to mark those that met specifications. Around 10 in the morning, I heard something that made me stop. It wasn't the normal forest sounds I was used to. The rustle of squirrels, the call of ravens, the wind through the branches. This was different. A low vocalization, almost like a moan, but deeper, resonant. It came from somewhere to my east, maybe 100 yards away. My first thought was bear. We had plenty of black bears in the area, sometimes grizzlies wandering down from the higher elevations. But this didn't sound quite right for bear. I stood still, listening. My father had taught me early that in the forest, patience was survival. Don't rush toward unknown sounds. Wait, watch, understand before you act. The vocalization came again, and this time I heard something else beneath it. A higher-pitched sound, almost like a whimper. My instincts told me it was an animal in distress, possibly injured. Against my better judgment, I started moving toward the sound. I moved carefully, stepping over fallen logs, pushing aside sword ferns that grew waist-high in this part of the forest. The smell hit me before I saw anything, a musky odor, strong but not unpleasant, like wet dog mixed with earth and something else I couldn't identify. I'd smelled plenty of animals in my life, but this was unique. Then I saw movement through the trees ahead, something large and dark. I crouched behind a massive cedar, peering around its trunk. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. About 30 yards away, partially hidden by undergrowth and shadows, was a creature I'd heard about all my life, but never believed existed. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, even sitting down, covered in reddish-brown hair that looked matted and unkempt. The body structure was wrong for any bear, too human-like, with broad shoulders and long arms. And beside it, much smaller, was what could only be described as an infant. The adult was female, I could tell that much from her build, and the way she held the baby. She was cradling it against her chest with one massive arm, while the other hand seemed to be examining something on the ground. The baby was making distressed sounds, and the mother was responding with soft vocalizations that sounded remarkably like comforting words, though I couldn't understand them. I should have been terrified. Everything I'd been taught said I should back away slowly, get out of there, report what I'd seen. But I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I watched, fascinated, as the mother tried repeatedly to get the baby to eat something she was holding. Berries, I realized. She was holding a cluster of huckleberries trying to feed her child. But the baby kept turning its head away, making those distressed sounds. That's when I noticed the mother's condition. Even from 30 yards away, I could see she was thin, too thin. Her ribs were visible through the hair on her sides. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like someone conserving energy because they didn't have much left. The baby looked even worse, its cries getting weaker. I understood then what I was witnessing. They were starving. I don't know what possessed me to do what I did next. Maybe it was the way the mother kept trying to feed her baby, the desperate patience in her movements. Maybe it was because I'd grown up around animals and understood that maternal instinct transcends species. Whatever the reason, I very slowly reached into my pack and pulled out my lunch. I had 2 sandwiches, turkey and cheese my wife had made that morning, an apple, and a bag of trail mix. Moving as quietly as I could, I stepped out from behind the cedar. The mother's head snapped toward me instantly. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, filled with wariness. She made a low warning sound, pulled her baby closer. I raised my hands slowly, showing I held no weapon, just food. I took 3 steps forward and gently placed the sandwiches on a flat rock, then backed away 10 paces. We looked at each other across that small distance. Her eyes never left mine. I could see the calculation happening behind them, the weighing of risk against need. I kept my hands visible, my posture non-threatening. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, she made a decision. Moving cautiously, never taking her eyes off me, she reached out with one long arm and snatched the sandwiches. She brought them to her nose, sniffed carefully, then did something that shocked me. She peeled back the bread, examining the contents before taking a small bite. She was checking if it was safe. After a moment, she ate 1 sandwich in 3 bites. The other she carefully broke into small pieces, feeding them to the baby. The infant took the food eagerly, and I could hear its distressed sounds quieting as it ate. The mother ate my apple next, core and all. Then the trail mix, picking through it with surprising delicacy, selecting pieces to give the baby first before eating the rest herself. When the food was gone, she looked at me again. The wariness was still there, but something else too. I'd seen that look before in the eyes of animals I'd helped. Recognition. Understanding that I meant no harm. She made a soft vocalization, picked up her baby, and in 3 smooth strides disappeared into the forest. The speed was remarkable, the silence even more so. One moment she was there, the next gone, as if she'd never existed. I stood in that clearing for a long time, my mind trying to process what had happened. I'd just fed a Bigfoot, a real living Bigfoot. Everything I'd been taught, everything I thought I knew about the natural world had just been turned upside down. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined it, if I'd hit my head or eaten some poisonous plant. But the rock where I'd placed the food was empty, and the musky smell still hung in the air. I didn't tell anyone, not my wife, not my supervisor, not my closest friends. Who would have believed me? I barely believed it myself. But the next day, when I packed my lunch, I added extra. 2 sandwiches for me, 2 for them, just in case. I returned to that section of forest the following week and the week after that. My official reason was completing the timber survey, but really I was hoping to see them again. On my 3rd trip back, I found them, or rather, they found me. I was sitting on a log, eating my lunch, when I heard movement behind me. I turned slowly, and there she was, about 20 yards away, the baby clinging to her back. She made a soft sound, not threatening, almost questioning. I reached into my pack and pulled out the extra sandwiches I'd brought. This time I didn't place them on a rock and back away. I held them out, arm extended, and waited. She studied me for a long moment, then took several steps closer. 10 yards. 5 yards. Close enough that I could see the individual hairs on her arm, see the way her nostrils flared as she scented the air, see the remarkable humanity in her eyes. She reached out, her movements careful, and took the sandwiches from my hand. Her fingers brushed mine for just a second. They were warm, leathery, incredibly strong. She backed away and fed the baby first again, just like before. Then she did something unexpected. She reached into the underbrush beside her and pulled out something, setting it carefully on the ground before retreating. When she was gone, I approached cautiously. It was a perfect pine cone, but arranged with it were several bright red salmon berries and what looked like a carefully selected stone, smooth and round. She had brought me a gift. That was how it started. Over the following weeks and months, I established a pattern. Twice a week, I'd hike into that section of forest, always bringing extra food. She was always there or would appear within minutes of my arrival. Sometimes she'd watch from a distance while I left food. Other times she'd approach close enough to take it from my hands. The baby, who I started thinking of as little one, grew stronger, more curious. By spring, the baby was climbing down from its mother's back to investigate things, always under her watchful eye. I learned to read her body language, her vocalizations. A low hum meant contentment. A sharp grunt was a warning, usually when I moved too quickly or got too close to the baby. A softer, trilling sound seemed to be directed at little one, probably telling the infant to stay close or be careful. She learned my patterns too, understood that I came on specific days, that I brought food, that I posed no threat. The arrangement might have continued just like that indefinitely. A simple exchange of food for silent companionship. But in late summer of 1974, something happened that changed our relationship forever. I arrived at our usual meeting spot on a Thursday morning and immediately knew something was wrong. She was there, but agitated, pacing back and forth in a small area. Little one was crying, a distressed sound that carried through the forest. The mother saw me and did something she'd never done before. She rushed toward me, stopping just a few feet away, and made urgent vocalizations, pointing back toward the trees. I didn't hesitate. I followed her. She moved quickly through the forest, constantly looking back to make sure I was keeping up. After about 200 yards, she stopped beside a small ravine. Little one was at the bottom, maybe 15 feet down, caught in the exposed roots of a tree. The infant had apparently tried to climb down, slipped, and gotten a leg wedged between roots and stone. The mother couldn't get down there. She was too large, too heavy. The ravine walls were crumbling shale that wouldn't support her weight. But I could. The ravine was narrow enough that I could climb down by bracing against both walls. I looked at her, this creature who by all rights should be mythical, and saw something in her eyes I recognized instantly. Desperation, trust. She was asking for help, trusting me with her child. I took off my pack and jacket, started climbing down carefully. Little one's cries intensified when I got close, and I heard the mother making soothing sounds from above. I talked softly to the infant as I worked, keeping my voice calm even though my heart was hammering. The leg was wedged tight, swollen from being trapped. I had to carefully move rocks, dig around the roots, all while the baby squirmed and cried. It took 20 minutes of painstaking work, but finally I got the leg free. Little one immediately tried to climb, wrapping surprisingly strong arms around my neck. The baby was heavier than I expected, maybe 40 pounds of solid muscle, but I managed to climb back up the ravine with the infant clinging to me. The moment we reached the top, the mother was there. She took her baby gently but quickly, examining the injured leg with her hands, making soft, concerned sounds. The leg didn't appear broken, just badly bruised and swollen. She looked at me then with an expression I'll never forget. Those dark eyes held something profound, something that transcended species, gratitude, understanding, and something else, a decision being made. She set little one down carefully, told the infant to stay with a gesture and vocalization. Then she approached me directly, closer than she'd ever been. She reached out one massive hand and placed it on my chest, right over my heart. She held it there for several seconds, her eyes locked on mine. Then she pointed at her own chest, at her baby, and back at me. The message was clear. You saved my child. I will remember. From that day forward, our relationship was different. She trusted me completely. She'd let little one play near me while I ate my lunch. She'd rest while I was there, something I'd never seen her do before. Sometimes she'd bring me things, interesting stones, unusual plants, once a perfect bird's nest she'd found. I started bringing different foods to learn what they liked. Fruit was always popular, especially berries and apples, nuts of any kind, raw vegetables like carrots. She seemed to especially love peanut butter sandwiches, and little one would get excited whenever I pulled out the jar. Over the following years, I watched little one grow. By 1976, the infant had transformed into a juvenile, more independent, but still close to its mother. I learned they had seasonal patterns, probably following food sources. Spring and fall, I saw them regularly. Winters, they seemed to move to lower elevations. Summers, they went higher into the mountains, but they always came back to our meeting spot when the seasons changed. I learned other things too. They communicated with a complex system of vocalizations, gestures, and what seemed like facial expressions. They used tools, though crude ones. I once watched the mother use a stick to dig for roots, teaching little one how to do the same. They had incredible memories. If I brought something they particularly liked, she'd make a specific sound the next time I showed up, like she was requesting that food again. They were clean, grooming each other's fur, washing in streams. They buried their waste, showed preferences for certain areas over others, exhibited behaviors that suggested not just intelligence, but culture. And slowly, very slowly, she began to communicate more directly with me. It started with simple gestures, pointing at food she wanted, holding up her hands to show how many fish were in the stream, making a counting gesture I eventually understood meant days until our next meeting. By 1978, we had a basic system. She'd figured out I didn't understand her vocalizations, so she adapted, using exaggerated gestures and expressions to convey meaning. One spring day in 1979, she did something remarkable. She'd been watching me write in my field notebook, something I often did after our meetings, recording observations I told myself I'd never share with anyone. She reached out and gently took the pencil from my hand. Then, with surprising delicacy for such large fingers, she drew a simple figure on the page, a stick representation of a larger figure next to a smaller one, her and little one. Then she pointed at herself, at the drawing at the notebook. She understood drawing was a form of communication. She understood I was recording something about her. I showed her my field guide, pointing at pictures of different plants and animals, saying their names. She watched intently, sometimes making her own sounds, which I assumed were her names for those things. It became a ritual. I'd bring books with pictures. We'd go through them together, bridging the gap between our species one image at a time. By 1980, little one had grown into a young adult, what I guessed was equivalent to a teenager in human years. The juvenile was almost as tall as its mother now, more adventurous, more curious about me. The young one had less fear, would come close to examine my backpack, my camera when I eventually brought one, my books. The mother would watch tolerantly but attentively, ready to intervene if needed. It was also around this time that I started noticing changes in her behavior. She became more cautious when we met, constantly scanning the forest, alert to every sound. She'd bring little one to our meetings, but would send the juvenile back into the forest to wait at a distance while she approached me alone. Her wariness wasn't directed at me, but at something else, something that worried her. One day in August of 1980, she did something that made my blood run cold. She'd been unusually agitated during our entire meeting. After she finished eating, she did something she'd never done before. She started drawing in the dirt with a stick. She drew what looked like trees, our forest. Then she drew several large figures, her kind. Then she drew smaller figures approaching the large ones, humans. She made the small figures surround the large ones. Then she made a violent slashing motion and covered the large figures with dirt. I understood what she was trying to tell me. Humans were hunting her people, killing them. She pointed at the drawing, then at herself, then at the trees around us. She made a gesture of hiding, covering. Her people were being hunted and they were hiding, terrified. She looked at me with those intelligent eyes and I saw something I'd never seen before. She was trying to tell me why they hid, why they feared, why encounters between our species were so rare. She wasn't done. She drew more in the dirt, herself, little one, more of her kind. Then she drew a line separating them from human figures. She pointed at me, at the human figures she'd drawn, then made a gesture that clearly meant different. She'd figured out I was different from the humans who hunted her people. But she needed me to understand what was at stake, that her species was being systematically destroyed by mine, and survival meant remaining hidden, remaining legend. I sat there in the dirt beside her, looking at the crude drawings that told a story of genocide. My throat felt tight. I'd spent 7 years building this relationship, learning to see her as a person, not a creature. And now she was showing me the brutal reality her people lived with every day. The constant fear, the dwindling numbers, the knowledge that humans, my species, were the greatest threat to her existence. She wasn't finished with her lesson. She smoothed out the dirt and started drawing again, this time with even more urgency. She drew what looked like a timeline, marking it with notches that I understood represented years or generations. She drew many large figures at the beginning, filling one section of her timeline. Then, as the timeline progressed, the figures got fewer and fewer. By the end, she drew only a handful. Her hand trembled as she made the final marks. She was showing me her species' decline, the inexorable march toward extinction. Then she did something that brought tears to my eyes. She pointed at the few remaining figures at the end of her timeline, then pointed at herself and gestured toward where little one waited in the trees. She drew a circle around the last figures, then looked at me with an expression of such profound sadness that it transcended the barrier between our species. She was telling me she might be among the last, that her child might grow up in a world where her kind had nearly vanished. I wanted to tell her I'd protect them, that I'd never let anyone harm them. But I also knew the limitations of what one man could do. Instead, I reached into my pack and pulled out my camera. I'd been bringing it for months but had never taken a photo, respecting what felt like an unspoken agreement. But now I held it up, showing it to her. She'd seen it before, had been curious about it. I pointed at the camera, then at her drawings in the dirt, then back at the camera. I mimed the act of showing others, of sharing what I'd learned. Her reaction was instant and violent. She stood abruptly, knocking the camera from my hands. Her eyes went wide with fear, and she made a sound I'd never heard before, something between a growl and a scream. Little one came crashing through the underbrush, responding to what must have been a distress call. The mother positioned herself between me and her child, her body language suddenly defensive, threatening. I raised my hands slowly, showing I meant no harm, but she wasn't looking at me the same way anymore. The trust, built so carefully over 7 years, felt like it was crumbling. I understood my mistake immediately. I'd suggested exposing them, making their existence known. To her, that wasn't salvation, that was a death sentence. I picked up the camera slowly, opened the back, and pulled out the film, exposing it to light. destroying any photos I might have taken. I set it on the ground and stepped back. Then I took the film and my field notebook, the one with all my observations about her, and placed them both on a flat rock. I pulled out my lighter and set them on fire. She watched as the film curled and melted, as the pages of my notebook blackened and turned to ash. 7 years of careful documentation gone. The only evidence I had of her existence destroyed. When the last ember died, I looked at her and made my own gestures. I pointed at my eyes, then at her, then made a covering motion over my mouth. I see you, but I won't speak. I pointed at the ashes, then made a gesture of scattering them to the wind. Your secret is safe. Everything I know stays with me. She watched me for a long moment. The tension slowly left her body. She made a soft sound to little one, who relaxed slightly but still watched me warily. Then she approached me, slowly, cautiously. When she was close enough, she reached out and placed her hand over my mouth, gentle but firm. The message was unmistakable. Silence. This secret requires silence. I nodded, and she removed her hand. Then she pointed at her eyes, at me, at her chest where her heart would be. She trusted me, but that trust came with responsibility, a burden I would carry for the rest of my life. Our relationship recovered from that moment, but it was different afterward. She'd shown me the stakes, the reality of what my curiosity and desire to document could cost. I continued bringing food, continued our meetings, but I brought no more cameras, no more notebooks. Everything I learned, I kept only in memory. As the years passed, I watched little one mature fully into adulthood. By 1983, the young one stood nearly 8 feet tall, powerful, and independent. I noticed subtle changes in their behavior. The young adult would disappear for longer periods, sometimes weeks at a time. The mother explained through gestures that little one was exploring, finding its own territory, the way young adults of any species eventually do. During one of these periods when the young one was away, in the fall of 1984, she brought me deeper into her world than ever before. She gestured for me to follow her, leading me away from our usual meeting spot. We walked for over an hour, her moving through the forest with that impossible silence while I crashed along behind, trying to keep up. Eventually, we reached a narrow ravine I'd never seen before, hidden behind a maze of fallen logs and dense undergrowth. She led me into the ravine, which opened up into a small, sheltered valley. And there, carved into the rock face, were petroglyphs, hundreds of them, ancient images of large bipedal figures, handprints that were easily twice the size of my own, symbols I couldn't begin to interpret. She pointed at the oldest, most weathered images, then at herself. Her people had been here for a very, very long time, long before Europeans came, long before even the native peoples whose descendants still lived in the region. She traced her fingers over the petroglyphs, and I understood she was showing me her heritage, her history. Some images showed groups of her kind living together. Others showed them interacting with early humans, the smaller figures clearly different from the larger ones. But as the images progressed along the rock face, becoming less weathered and more recent, the tone changed. The groups of large figures became smaller. Images showed conflict, showed the large figures fleeing, hiding. The most recent images, perhaps only decades old, showed solitary figures or small family groups. The visual history confirmed what she'd tried to tell me with her dirt drawings. Her people were vanishing. She pointed at one particular image, fresher than most of the others. It showed a large figure and a small one, standing beside a human figure. She pointed at it, then at herself, at me, at the forest around us. She'd recorded our relationship here on these ancient stones, adding our story to the long history of her people. I felt the weight of that gesture. In her eyes, what we'd built together over 11 years was significant enough to be memorialized, to be preserved in stone alongside centuries of her people's existence. We sat in that hidden valley for hours. She showed me other things, drawings of plants that her people used for medicine, symbols that seemed to mark territories or important locations. She tried to teach me some of her vocalizations, though my throat couldn't produce the sounds correctly. I tried to teach her some words, and while she couldn't speak them, I could tell she understood their meaning. We were bridging a gap that wasn't supposed to be bridgeable, finding common ground between species that had spent millennia avoiding each other. As afternoon turned to evening and we prepared to leave, she did something unexpected. She gathered several stones from the ravine floor and built a small cairn at the base of the petroglyphs. Then she looked at me and gestured that I should do the same. I understood. We were making a marker, a monument to the relationship between our species, not a relationship of hunter and hunted, but of friendship and trust. I built my cairn next to hers, and we stood there together, two beings from different worlds, sharing a moment of understanding in a hidden valley that time had forgotten. The walk back to our usual meeting spot was quiet, contemplative. As we parted ways that evening, she made a gesture I'd seen her use with little one, a sort of embrace without touching, arms held out as if holding someone close. I mimicked it back to her, understanding it was her way of showing affection, of saying goodbye in a way that meant until we meet again. By 1985, I'd been visiting her for 12 years. I was 39 years old, and my life had settled into a pattern built around these meetings. My wife had passed away 2 years earlier, cancer taking her quickly and mercilessly. I had no children. My job with Weyerhaeuser had evolved. I'd moved into management, but I made sure my responsibilities kept me in the field, kept me with access to these forests. Everything in my life orbited around these encounters, around this relationship that I could never tell anyone about. That spring, she brought me another revelation. She appeared at our meeting spot with something I'd never seen before. A young male of her kind, smaller than her but fully adult, maybe 7 feet tall. My first instinct was fear. I'd only ever interacted with her and little one. This was an unknown variable, but she made calming gestures, positioned herself between us, and I understood she was introducing me, showing him I was safe. The young male was cautious, wary, but curious. He circled me at a distance while she vocalized to him, presumably explaining who I was, what our relationship had been. After several minutes, he approached closer, close enough to take food from my hand. His grip was different from hers, less gentle, more testing. He was evaluating me, determining if I was a threat. I stayed still, non-threatening, letting him make all the decisions. After he'd eaten and accepted my presence, she made gestures that I interpreted as introduction. She pointed at herself, then at him, then made a gesture I'd learned meant family or kin. This was a relative of hers, perhaps a brother or cousin. She'd brought him here for a reason. Through a series of gestures and drawings in the dirt, she explained. Little one, now fully adult and independent, had gone to find a mate. This male was part of another small family group, and she was expanding my knowledge, letting me know that there were others, that her kind still existed in small pockets throughout these mountains. Over the following months, the male occasionally accompanied her to our meetings. I learned he was less communicative than she was, more primitive in his interactions. But he was also protective of her, watchful in a way that suggested he knew the dangers that humans posed. His presence made me realize something important. She'd been teaching me for years, training me to understand her people, and now she was using me as a teaching tool for others, showing them that not all humans were threats, that there could be another way. By 1986, I'd accumulated 13 years of interactions, memories I carried like precious secrets. I'd learned their seasonal patterns, their dietary preferences, glimpses of their social structure. I'd seen them grieve when the young male who'd been visiting stopped coming, and I understood from her gestures that he'd been killed, probably by hunters or possibly by accident in the increasing logging operations that were carving up these forests. I'd seen her joy when little one returned after a long absence, now accompanied by a mate, proving that her genetic line would continue at least one more generation. But I'd also seen the fear growing. The forests were shrinking. Roads were pushing deeper into the wilderness. Logging operations were becoming more aggressive, clear-cutting entire mountainsides. The pockets of deep forest where her people could hide were disappearing year by year. Every time we met, she seemed more anxious, more desperate to communicate something important. I could sense she was building towards something, preparing to share something significant. And I was right. It was a cold morning in November of 1987, almost exactly 14 years since our first encounter. I hiked to our meeting spot with my usual supplies, plus extra because I knew she'd been eating for two lately. Little one's mate was pregnant, which meant she'd become a grandmother soon. The thought filled me with an emotion I couldn't quite name, something between joy and desperate sadness. New life was coming into a dying species. She was already waiting when I arrived, which was unusual. Normally she'd appear a few minutes after I settled in, but today she was standing in the center of the clearing, and her posture told me immediately that something was different. Something was wrong. Her shoulders were hunched, her head slightly bowed. When she looked up at me, I saw tears glistening in her eyes. Yes, tears, real tears, streaming down through the hair on her face. I approached slowly, setting down my pack. She made a gesture for me to sit, so I lowered myself to a fallen log. She sat across from me, closer than she'd ever sat before, maybe 6 feet separating us. For a long moment, she just looked at me, and I could see her struggling with something, trying to find a way to communicate what she needed to tell me. Finally, she began to draw in the dirt between us. But this time her drawings were different, more detailed, more deliberate. She drew a map, and I recognized it immediately. It was this region, the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, Mount Adams looming to the north. She marked several spots with X marks, and I understood these were locations where her people lived or had lived. Then she drew human figures approaching each location, and what she drew next made my stomach turn. She drew the human figures with long sticks, guns. She showed them surrounding the X marks. She showed the large figures, her people, falling. At each location, she made a mark to indicate death. Then she moved to the next location on her map and repeated the process. Systematic hunting, systematic extermination. She was showing me that her people weren't just dying out from loss of habitat or low population numbers. They were being actively hunted, targeted, eliminated. She looked up at me, and in her eyes, I saw something that broke my heart. She was asking me, why? Why did humans do this? Why couldn't her people simply be left alone? I had no answer that would make sense. No way to explain the human capacity for destroying what we fear or don't understand. But she wasn't done. She smoothed the dirt and started drawing again, and this is where she finally revealed what she'd been building toward for years. She drew 2 types of humans. One group she drew normally, just simple stick figures, but the other group she drew with specific marks, symbols. She pointed at the first group, then at me, making a gesture that meant, like you. Regular people. Then she pointed at the second group and made a series of gestures that I struggled to interpret. She drew them coming to the forest with vehicles, with equipment, with organization. She drew the scene of a hunt, showing her people being tracked, surrounded. But this wasn't a random encounter. This was coordinated, professional. She drew what looked like nets, tranquilizer darts, cages. Some of her people were being taken alive. She pointed at the ground where she'd drawn cages, then made a gesture I'd learned meant gone or disappeared. They were being captured and taken somewhere, never to be seen again. Then she drew something that chilled me to my core. She drew a building, a structure. Inside it, she drew one of her people strapped down and multiple human figures around it. She made a cutting gesture, a dissection. She was showing me experimentation, vivisection. Some of her people were being taken to laboratories and cut apart while still alive. I felt sick. My hands were shaking. She reached across the space between us and gripped my wrist, not hard, but firm enough to make me focus. She pointed at the organized human figures again, then made a gesture that suggested official, authority, power. This wasn't just random hunters or trophy seekers. This was organized, possibly governmental. People with resources, with knowledge of how to track her kind, with the infrastructure to capture and transport them. She let go of my wrist and pulled back slightly. Then she did something that demonstrated just how intelligent she truly was. She drew a timeline again, but this one stretched into the future. She showed her people's numbers dwindling further, the X marks on her map disappearing one by one. At the end of the timeline, she drew nothing, extinction, and she indicated through gestures that this wasn't decades away. This was within her lifetime, within the next generation. Her grandchild, when it was born, might be among the very last of her kind. Then came the moment that would haunt me forever. She looked directly into my eyes and made a series of gestures I'd never seen before. She pointed at me, then at her drawings of regular humans. She made a sweeping gesture that encompassed all the humans in the world. Then she pointed at the organized hunters, the ones taking her people. She made another sweeping gesture. Finally, she pointed at her chest, at the drawings of her people, at the map showing their dwindling locations. And then she made a gesture of weighing, like scales balancing. She was asking me a question. Why do your people hate mine? What did we do to deserve this? We hide, we avoid, we ask nothing. We take nothing that isn't ours. We harm no one unless threatened. So why? Why do humans, who have everything, who own the entire world, need to destroy the few of us who remain? I sat there with tears running down my face because I had no answer she would understand. How could I explain human fear of the unknown? How could I explain that some humans feel threatened by anything they can't control or categorize? How could I explain that to some people? Her kind represented a challenge to human supremacy, a suggestion that we weren't alone at the top of the evolutionary ladder, and that was intolerable. Instead, I did the only thing I could. I reached into my pack and pulled out photographs. Over the years, I'd occasionally brought pictures to show her. Images from magazines of different animals, different places, but these photos were different. I'd brought images of human history, pictures from books, images of slavery, of genocide, of war. I showed her humans hurting other humans, humans destroying their own kind over differences in skin color, religion, nationality. I pointed at these images, then at her drawings of what was happening to her people. I made a gesture of sameness, of equivalence. I was trying to tell her that this wasn't personal, that it wasn't about her species specifically. Humans did this to everyone, to everything, even to ourselves. We were a species that struggled with the existence of other, whether that other was a different race, a different religion, or an entirely different species. She studied the photographs for a long time, picking them up carefully with her large fingers, examining each one. When she looked back at me, the expression on her face had shifted. The question in her eyes had changed. Before, she'd been asking why humans hated her people. Now she seemed to be asking something deeper. How do humans live with themselves? How do you function knowing your species does these things? I had no good answer to that either. I just spread my hands in a gesture of helplessness, of acknowledgement. We were a broken species in many ways, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, capable of incredible compassion and unspeakable cruelty, often simultaneously. And those of us who saw both sides of that coin had to find ways to live with the weight of it. She set the photographs down carefully and sat back. For several minutes, we just sat there in silence. Two beings from different worlds sharing the heavy burden of truth. Then she stood and gestured for me to follow. We walked, not to the hidden valley with the petroglyphs, but somewhere new. After about 45 minutes of hiking, she brought me to a small cave, carefully concealed behind a curtain of hanging moss and rock. Inside the cave, my eyes adjusted to the dimness, and I saw something that made me catch my breath. Bones, dozens of them, arranged carefully on natural stone shelves. They were the bones of her people, each skeleton positioned respectfully, accompanied by objects, stones, feathers, bits of bone carved with symbols. This was a burial site, a sacred place where her people laid their dead to rest. She moved to one particular shelf where smaller bones lay. A child, I realized. She touched the small skull gently, reverently. Then she turned to me and through gestures told me a story. This had been her first child, born many years before I met her. The infant had been sickly, hadn't survived its first winter. She'd carried that grief for decades, and when she'd found herself pregnant again, years later with little one, she'd been terrified of losing another child. That's why she'd been so thin, so desperate when I first found her. She'd been giving all her food to little one, sacrificing herself to ensure her baby survived. She gestured around the cave at all the bones. Each represented a life, a story, a member of her vanishing people. Some had died of old age, she indicated, others from accidents, some from disease. But increasingly, she showed me bones that had marks on them, bullet holes, trauma from traps, evidence of violence. Her people's graveyard was filling with the victims of human aggression. Then she showed me something even more heartbreaking, a section of the cave that was empty, prepared, stone shelves that had been carefully smoothed and arranged but held no bones yet. She pointed at these empty spaces, then at herself, then at where little one would be in the forest. She was preparing their burial places. She expected that she and her family would die violently, probably soon, and she wanted to ensure that someone would know where to lay them to rest with honor. She looked at me and pointed at the cave, at the bones, at the empty shelves. Then she pointed at me again and made a covering gesture, a protecting gesture. She was entrusting me with the location of this sacred place, asking me to promise that if the worst happened, I would make sure their remains were treated with respect, that they wouldn't be taken away to laboratories or museums, that they would rest here with their ancestors. I placed my hand over my heart and nodded. I would protect this place. I would honor that promise if it came to that. She seemed satisfied with my response. We spent another hour in that cave while she showed me other things, tried to teach me more about her people's customs, their beliefs about death and what came after. I understood perhaps a fraction of what she was trying to communicate, but I listened, I observed, I committed every detail to memory. When we finally emerged from the cave and she carefully rearranged the moss and rocks to conceal the entrance again, the sun was beginning to set. She walked me partway back toward our usual meeting spot. But before we parted, she did something she'd never done before. She embraced me. Actually embraced me, pulling me against her massive chest, her long arms wrapping around me carefully. I could hear her heartbeat, slow and strong, could feel the warmth of her through her thick hair. She held me like that for maybe 30 seconds, and I understood what it meant. Goodbye. Not until next time, but possibly goodbye forever. When she released me and stepped back, I saw tears in her eyes again. She made a gesture toward the direction of my truck, telling me to go, to be safe. Then she turned and melted into the forest, moving with that silent grace that always amazed me. I stood there for a long time after she disappeared, knowing that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship, in the world. That was the last time I saw her alive. I returned to our meeting spot the following week, and the week after that. She never came. Little one never appeared. The young male she'd introduced me to years before, gone. I spent months hiking deeper into the forest, searching for any sign of them, any indication they were still alive. I found nothing. The forest seemed emptier, quieter, like something vital had been removed from it. In the spring of 1988, I hiked to the cave she'd shown me. The concealment had been disturbed. Inside, I found fresh bones, 3 skeletons arranged with the same care and reverence I'd seen before. One was large, female. One was smaller, also female, and clearly pregnant, based on the positioning of the remains. One was male, medium-sized. I recognized them from the unique scars and bone structures I'd observed over the years. It was her, it was little one and the mate. It was the young male who'd visited us. Someone had hunted them down and killed them, but someone else, perhaps another of her kind who'd survived, had brought them here and laid them to rest properly. On the stone shelf beside her remains, arranged carefully, I found something that made me break down sobbing. She'd left items for me. A smooth stone I'd given her years ago, a perfect pine cone from our first gift exchange, and scratched into the rock wall beside her resting place, a simple drawing. 2 figures, one large and one human-sized, hands reaching toward each other. Our story preserved here in the place where her people came to rest. I kept my promise to her. I've never told anyone the location of that cave. I've never revealed the places where her people lived and died. For 37 years since that last meeting, I've carried this secret, this burden, this gift she gave me. The gift of truly knowing another intelligent species, the gift of friendship that transcended everything that should have made it impossible. But I'm 78 years old now. I have cancer, the same disease that took my wife. The doctors give me maybe 6 months, probably less. And I find I can't take this story with me into death. Someone needs to know what existed, what we lost, what we're still losing. I don't know if any of her people survived. I've spent decades hoping, watching the forests, looking for signs. I've heard stories occasionally from other hikers, glimpsed tracks that might have been theirs, but I've never had another encounter. If they're still out there, they've learned the lesson she tried to teach them. Stay hidden, trust no one, survive in the shadows. What she revealed to me in those final meetings was the darkest truth about humanity. We can't coexist with other intelligent beings. We can't tolerate the existence of something that challenges our assumptions about our place in the world. We'd rather destroy them than share the planet with them. And we do it systematically, efficiently, without mercy. She asked me why, through her gestures and drawings. Why do humans hate her people? And the answer is simple and terrible. We don't hate them. Hate requires seeing them as important enough to oppose. No, we do something worse. We see them as things to be controlled, studied, eliminated if they can't be controlled. We see them as resources, as curiosities, as problems to be solved. We don't grant them the basic dignity of being recognized as people with rights to exist. I think about her often, especially now as my own end approaches. I think about the 14 years we spent building that impossible friendship. I think about the trust she placed in me despite every reason to fear my kind. I think about the hope in her eyes when she showed me little one, healthy and strong, proof that her sacrifice had meant something. I think about the grief in her eyes when she showed me that timeline stretching toward extinction. And I think about the question she never got to ask, but that I know haunted her. If one human could learn to see her as a person, could learn to care about her and her family, could prove that friendship between species was possible, then why couldn't the rest of humanity make that same leap? Why did individual compassion never scale up to collective compassion? Why did human society, human institutions, human governments choose elimination over coexistence? I don't have answers to those questions. I've spent 37 years thinking about them, and I still don't have answers. All I have is my memory of her, of little one growing up strong and curious, of quiet mornings in the forest sharing food and trying to communicate across the vast divide between our species, of the moment she placed her hand over my heart and I knew I'd been given a gift most humans never receive: recognition from another, intelligent being that I was worthy of trust. She's been dead for 37 years, but I still bring food to our old meeting spot twice a week, just in case, just in hope. The forest has changed so much since those days. The logging roads push deeper, the recreational areas expand, the wilderness shrinks, and somewhere in the remaining wild places, if any of her people survived, they're watching, hiding, fearing, knowing that discovery means death. This is what she revealed to me about humans, and it's taken me nearly 4 decades to find the courage to say it out loud. We are the monster in every story. We are the thing that lurks in the dark, hunting, killing, destroying without mercy. And the truly terrifying part is that we do it while believing we're righteous, while believing we're protecting ourselves, while believing that anything different from us must be threat. She was my friend. She saved my life once when I fell through ice on a frozen stream, and she pulled me out despite the risk to herself. She shared her world with me. She taught me that intelligence and emotion exist in forms we don't recognize, that personhood isn't limited to human DNA. And we killed her for it. Not me personally, but we, humanity, my species, we hunted her family and murdered them, probably in the name of science or national security or protecting the public from the unknown. I hope her grandchild survived somehow. I hope there's still a chance, however slim, that her genetic line continues. But I'm not optimistic. I've seen what we do to things we fear. I've spent my entire adult life watching my species' relentless march across every ecosystem, consuming, destroying, eliminating anything that stands in our way. She asked me what her people did to deserve this. The answer is nothing. They did nothing except exist. And in a world dominated by humans, apparently that's crime enough. This is my confession, my testimony, my memorial to her, to the friend I knew for 14 years and mourned for 37, to the mother who sacrificed everything for her child, to the teacher who patiently helped a dense human understand the richness of her culture, to the person who placed her trust in me despite knowing what my species was capable of. Her name, in the vocalizations I could never properly reproduce, meant something like, "She who remembers." It was fitting. She carried the memories of her people, their history, their traditions, their knowledge. She remembered when her kind was numerous, when they lived without fear, when the forests belonged to everyone and no one. And now I remember her. It's all I can do. Remember and bear witness to what we lost when we chose fear over friendship, control over coexistence, elimination over understanding. I remember, and I tell this story, and I hope that somewhere, somehow, someone will learn from it. We'll choose differently when faced with something unknown. We'll see the person behind the unfamiliar face. We'll build bridges instead of walls. But I'm not optimistic about that either, because in 51 years, she's the only one of her kind I ever truly knew. And that, more than anything, is the tragedy. Not just that her people are dying, but that so few humans will ever know what we've lost. The wisdom, the perspective, the different way of seeing the world that comes from a species that chose harmony with nature over dominion. We're killing them, and we're killing part of ourselves in the process. The part that could have learned from them, the part that could have been better. She who remembers is dead. Her daughter is dead. Her grandchild, if it was born, is probably dead. And the world spins on, ignorant and uncaring, while another intelligent species slips quietly into extinction. This is what she revealed to me. This is the truth I carry. This is my burden and my gift, the knowledge that something precious existed, that I was privileged to know it, and that my species destroyed it because we couldn't tolerate the existence of another mind that wasn't ours to control. I'll be dead soon. This story will be all that remains. I don't know if it will change anything. Probably not. But at least someone will know. Someone will understand that they were real, that they were people, that they deserve better than what we gave them. And maybe, just maybe, if any of her kind still survive in the deep places where humans rarely go, they'll know that at least one human remembered, one human cared, one human tried, however inadequately, to honor the friendship they offered across the impossible divide between species. Rest in peace, my friend, she who remembers. You deserved a better world than the one we gave you. Your trust was a gift I never earned but always treasured. And your question, why do humans hate us, echoes in my mind every day. I'm sorry I never had a good answer. I'm sorry my species failed you so completely. I'm sorry that friendship wasn't enough to save you. In the years after I found their remains, I became obsessed with understanding what had happened. I couldn't let it go. Couldn't accept that they'd simply vanished without anyone being held accountable. I started asking questions carefully, discreetly. I talked to other forestry workers, park rangers, local hunters. I listened to stories in bars and coffee shops, anywhere people gathered who spent time in the deep woods. What I discovered was chilling in its implications. There was a pattern. Throughout the late 80s, multiple people reported encounters with what they described as organized teams in the forest. Not typical hunters or hikers, but professionals with expensive equipment, military-style coordination. They'd appear in remote areas, stay for several days or weeks, then vanish. Local authorities were told to stay away, that it was federal jurisdiction, classified operations. One retired park ranger, a man named Donald Briggs, who'd worked in the Gifford Pin Show for 30 years, told me something over drinks one night in 1991. He'd been ordered to clear hikers from a specific area in October of 1987. No explanation given, just orders from above. He'd complied, setting up roadblocks, posting closure signs. 3 days later, he'd heard sounds in the night. Not gunshots exactly, but compressed air like tranquilizer guns. And something else, vocalizations that didn't sound like any animal he knew. The next morning, the roadblocks were removed, the signs taken down, and he was told the operation was complete and to never speak of it again. October of 1987, that was when she stopped coming to our meetings. That was when they died. The timeline matched perfectly, and the location Briggs described was within miles of where I'd last seen her. I wanted to confront someone, to demand answers, to make someone pay for what they'd done. But who? Which agency? Which department? And what proof did I have? A lifetime of memories that I'd promised to keep secret. Observations I'd deliberately never documented. A relationship I'd kept hidden for 14 years. I realized then the full cruelty of the situation. They'd been erased perfectly. No bodies that any one official would acknowledge. No evidence that could be presented. No way to prove they'd ever existed. And anyone who might have known the truth, like me, was either complicit through silence or would be dismissed as crazy if they spoke up. It was the perfect crime. Eliminate an entire species and leave no trace, no accountability, no consequences. I tried once to write an anonymous letter to the Seattle Times detailing what I knew. I got as far as 3 pages before I realized the futility. Without evidence, it would be dismissed as the ravings of a Bigfoot enthusiast. With evidence, with photos or remains, I'd be betraying her trust, turning her into exactly what she'd feared, a specimen, a curiosity, a thing to be studied rather than a person to be respected. I burned that letter just like I'd burned my field notes years before, so I carried it alone. My second wife, I remarried in 1992, noticed my sadness, the way I'd sometimes stare into the forest with tears in my eyes. She thought I was mourning my first wife, and I let her believe that. It was easier than the truth. We divorced in 2003, and she told me as she left that I'd never really been present in our marriage, that part of me was always somewhere else. She was right. Part of me was still in that clearing, waiting for a friend who would never return. I retired from Weyerhaeuser in 2005 at age 59. I used my savings to buy a small cabin on the edge of the Gifford Pinchot, as close to our meeting spot as I could get. I spent my retirement hiking those forests, maintaining the trails, removing illegal traps I'd find, protecting the wilderness in small ways. It was my penance, my continuing promise to her. If I couldn't save her, I could at least try to preserve the world she'd loved, and I kept bringing food to our meeting spot, every Tuesday and Friday without fail for 37 years. At first, I brought the same things she'd loved: peanut butter sandwiches, apples, trail mix. Later, when I finally accepted she was gone, I brought them as offerings, memorial gifts. I'd sit on that same log where we'd shared so many quiet mornings, and I'd talk to her. I'd tell her about the world, about how the forests were changing, about the species humans had managed to save and those we'd failed. I'd apologize over and over for not being able to protect her. Sometimes other hikers would come through and find me there, an old man sitting alone with a pack full of food, talking to the trees. They'd give me strange looks, and I'd smile and say I was remembering an old friend. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. In 2015, something happened that gave me a flicker of hope. I was hiking in a remote area, about 10 miles from our old meeting spot, when I found a track, a footprint in the mud beside a creek that was unmistakably not human, not bear, not any known animal. It was weathered, maybe a few days old, but the size and shape were exactly what I remembered. 18 inches long, 5 toes, the distinctive mid-tarsal break that her kind had. I spent 3 days searching that area, barely sleeping, pushing my then 69-year-old body to its limits. I never saw anything, but I found 2 more prints and something else. Scratched into the bark of a cedar tree about 7 feet up was a symbol. It was crude, simple, but I recognized it. It was one of the symbols from the petroglyphs she'd shown me, the one that meant safe place or sanctuary. Someone had marked this territory, whether it was one of her kind or if perhaps, impossibly miraculously, her grandchild had survived. I'll never know. But the possibility was enough to sustain me for years. The possibility that some part of her continued, that her genetic line hadn't been completely exterminated, that somewhere in these vast forests, hidden in the deepest places, a handful might still survive. I never found another track, never saw another sign, but I also never stopped looking, never stopped hoping, and I've never stopped bringing food to our meeting spot, just in case the impossible happens and one of her kind is desperate enough or curious enough to take a chance on a human again. 3 months ago, when the doctors told me the cancer had spread too far for treatment, my first thought was about the cave. I needed to make sure someone would protect it after I was gone. But who could I trust with that responsibility? Who would understand the sacred nature of that place, the importance of keeping it secret? I decided to make arrangements with the National Forest Service, but indirectly. I've purchased the land around the cave entrance, using a conservation trust I established. The deed specifies that it's to remain forever wild, never to be developed, never to be disturbed. I've hidden the entrance so well that even if someone stumbles across the area, they'd need to know exactly where to look. The bones will rest undisturbed, protected by legal frameworks and natural concealment. As for our meeting spot, I've been bringing stones there for the past few months, building a small cairn. To anyone who finds it, it'll just look like a trail marker. But I know what it really is. It's a monument to friendship across impossible divides. It's a memorial to she who remembers. It's a testament to what might have been if humans had chosen differently. Last week, I brought my final offering to that spot. I was too weak to hike the full distance, so I drove as close as the logging roads would take me and walked the last mile, leaning on a walking stick, stopping every few minutes to catch my breath. When I reached the clearing, I added one final stone to the cairn. Then I sat on our log, probably for the last time, and I spoke to her one more time. I told her that I'd kept my promise, that her burial place remained secret and protected, that I'd never exploited our friendship or used her memory for personal gain. I told her that I'd spent my entire adult life trying to be worthy of the trust she'd placed in me. I told her that I was sorry, so desperately sorry, that trust hadn't been enough to save her. And I told her that I was finally going to break my silence, that I was going to tell our story, not to prove Bigfoot exists, not to vindicate myself or seek recognition, but so that someone, somewhere might understand what was lost. So that maybe, if any of her kind still survive, there might be one more human in the world who knows the truth and might choose protection over exploitation. The sun was setting as I prepared to leave that clearing for the last time. The forest was quiet except for the wind in the trees and the distant call of a raven. And then I heard something that made me freeze, a vocalization, low and resonant, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was unmistakable. It was the sound she used to make, the one that meant farewell until we meet again. I don't know if it was real or if my dying mind was giving me a final gift, a moment of closure. I don't know if one of her kind was out there, had been watching me all these years, had seen my weekly pilgrimages and understood. I don't know if her grandchild survived and grew old in these forests, maintaining a vigil as I maintained mine, but I choose to believe. I choose to believe that somewhere in the deep places, in the hidden valleys and forgotten corners of these mountains, they persist. Fewer than before, more cautious than ever, but alive. I choose to believe that she who remembers lives on in her descendants, that her memories, her wisdom, her culture continues in some form. And I choose to believe that telling this story honors her more than silence would, that somewhere she understands why I'm finally speaking, that she knows this isn't betrayal but tribute, that breaking a promise to protect her memory serves her better than keeping a promise that would let her be forgotten. But I remember. And now, through this story, others will remember too. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's all I have left to give. To anyone who reads this, I ask only one thing. If you spend time in wild places, if you glimpse something you can't explain, if you find evidence of something that shouldn't exist, I beg you to choose compassion over curiosity. Choose protection over proof. Choose silence over fame. Let them be. Let them survive. Let them exist in peace in the small corners of wilderness we haven't yet destroyed. And if you can't do that, if you feel compelled to pursue, to document, to prove, then at least do it with respect. Remember that they're people, not specimens. That they have families, feelings, fears. That they're intelligent beings who deserve the same dignity and rights we claim for ourselves. She who remembers taught me that friendship can exist across any divide if both parties choose to build bridges instead of walls. She taught me that intelligence takes many forms, that personhood isn't defined by DNA. She taught me that trust is precious and fragile and worth any sacrifice to honor. But most importantly, she taught me what we lose when we choose fear over understanding. We don't just lose them, we lose part of ourselves. The part that could have learned from their wisdom. The part that could have grown from seeing the world through different eyes. The part that could have been better, kinder, more complete. I'll be gone soon. This story will be all that remains of my time with her, of the impossible friendship we built, of the lessons she tried to teach me. I hope it matters. I hope someone hears it and chooses differently. I hope that somewhere, in some future I won't live to see, humans learn to share the world instead of dominating it. But hope has proven to be a fragile thing in my long life, so I'll settle for this. Let them remember. Let them know she existed, that she mattered, that she was my friend. Let the record show that once, in a forgotten corner of the Pacific Northwest, two species found common ground. And let it also show what my species did with that gift. We destroyed it, because that's what we do, and shame on us for it. Rest in peace, my friend. She who remembers. You deserved better. The world deserved you.